Family business makes no sense. So let's talk about it.
Welcome to another episode of Family Business Challenges. I'm Jon Kenfield, the Family Business Solutionist, broadcasting from Melbourne in Australia. I've worked with families in business for several decades, and the main thing that I've learned over that period is that family business as a concept makes no sense. Family and business are opposing entities, and the things that make families work well are in conflict with the things that make businesses work well. Therefore, every family business, pretty much like every family, but to a much higher degree, is going to find itself in conflict at some time, if not at many times. And the point of these videos, which deal with 50 of the most common causes of conflict, is to help you, if you are daft or game enough to be in a family business, to make sense of being in a family business. Because we all know that family businesses can be fantastic. But what we don't talk nearly enough about, in my view, is what goes wrong, the victims of bad family businesses, and how can we avoid them going wrong so we get all the benefits. Today's episode is talking about narcissism. And I can barely remember the last family I worked with where in a blocked succession process, and a lot of my work involves succession processes, generational transitions that have stalled, I can hardly remember the time when somebody in the family hadn't consulted Dr. Google and come to the conclusion that a father or a mother or a sibling or some or all of the above was a grandiose narcissist. The term narcissism gets thrown around an awful lot these days, and it's often used to suggest something seriously negative and a person that we find very difficult to deal with. So what I'm going to do in this particular episode is talk a bit about what is narcissism, what do we observe it doing to families in business to create conflict, how can you prevent those things from happening, and if they are happening, what is the best way to deal with them to try and get a good outcome for everybody. So if that's of interest to you, please listen on. Let's start by defining what narcissism is, at least for our purposes, and therefore what it isn't. Narcissism is a personality trait. It describes, typically, somebody with a domineering, self-centered ego and really a lack of empathy for other people. There's much more to it than that, but that's the common use of the phrase. Now what I'm going to do is explain why we should consider it as something much more generic, because it's important to understand what we're dealing with if we're going to deal with it. First point to note is that where does it all come from? Well, narcissism in an individual, we'll get to, it comes from their history. Narcissism for the human race is perhaps part of the evolutionary development of social interaction that enabled Homo sapiens to overcome all competitors to become the dominant species on the planet. The theory goes that Homo sapiens were better than any other creature, just about, other than probably buffalo and sheep, in getting together in really large groups. And those large groups developed the ability to hunt and protect, and therefore they were able to dominate faster, scarier, toothier competitors, and even bigger, stronger, more intelligent potential adversaries like Neanderthals. And because humans learned to work in very big groups, they became dominant. And one of the elements that enabled them to work in big groups was developing a sense of self, developing a sense of place in a community, developing the confidence to have self-regard and to then exert power over others, and arguably that is one of the evolutionary roots of narcissism, because narcissism is all about having some self-regard. Now, self-regard, as just explained, is not necessarily a bad thing, provided it is relatively under control and is used for good rather than for evil. If we follow that line of thinking through, we would conclude that everybody is on the spectrum of narcissism. From below the line saintly, who are people with no self-regard, they're only there for others, and they are very, very difficult to deal with. I don't actually understand what makes them tick, so we take them out of the equation. You don't find many of those people working in family business, in my experience. Our starting point then on the narcissism spectrum is the healthy narcissist, the person who has a healthy regard for themselves, a reasonable sense of self-image, an understanding of where they fit in the wider world, and reasonable comfort with what that place is. They're not constantly looking for validation and confirmation from others, so they are more likely to be introverted because a lot of their personal power and energy is internally motivated. They don't need to worry about what other people think. But because we're now talking about the healthy narcissist with a balanced personality, they are very good at reading the tea leaves, at empathizing with other people, at creating intimate relationships. So that is almost our ideal person, and because they're the ideal person, they're often not very good at establishing businesses. They're typically not your normal entrepreneur, who actually need a bit of mongrel in them usually to drive past barriers and not worry what other people think about them, and therefore to follow their own dreams. So let's move on up through the scale here. After the healthy narcissist, we have the mild narcissist, somebody who is a little bit less self-assured and is looking for a bit more validation, confirmation, acknowledgement from other people to confirm that what they are doing is admired by others. So they're not the complete self-starter, they are looking externally, but they are still in a pretty comfortable place where they are able to empathize with others, establish intimate relationships, they will concern for the welfare of others, and they can be good collaborative leaders. Then we move up to the third group of narcissists who straddle the line between good and evil. These are the moderate narcissists. They have enough self-interest to be self-aware, they know themselves reasonably well, they have an ability to empathize with others, but it's not one of their major drivers, so they're not incapacitated by concern for others. They will get on with doing what needs to be done because they are driven, and they'll deal with the feelings and the thoughts and the needs of others as and when, but it's not going to hold them back. On the other side of the line, they are now at the point where they perhaps need more validation. That's not the same as approval, but they need validation from others. So they will be status conscious. They will want to be seen to be in positions of importance. That can be a problem for a succession process, because if somebody's self-image is tied up with their position, they're not likely to step down as a CEO or managing director of a business if that's why they have the Mercedes and the corner office and the place at the Australia Club or wherever they happen to be seen to be one of the hoi polloi. And so that is where the moderate narcissist is seen to be straddling the line. They can be very powerful individuals who drive to achieve their goals, which in a family business context will mean they'll drive hard to be successful in business and be successful financially, but they are still able to connect with others to a reasonable degree. They're not held back by it at all though. We then move on to the severe narcissists. Now these are the ones who are often have the symptoms of grandiose narcissism. They are more declaratory about what they see as their natural superiority over others. They are likely to have much less empathy for others, if any, and they are very much driven to follow their own agendas and they seek status and prestige, acknowledgement, validation, adoration, encouragement for doing that. These are the people who typically, if it's mother or father, sometimes both, but those marriages don't tend to last for that long. If it's often a parent who is way past their use-by date, maybe they're well into their mid-80s and they had promised and should have retired 15, maybe 20 years earlier for the sake of the business and the sake of the family. These are the ones who frequently have a complete squirrel grip on the finances, on the company, on the business, no matter what promises they've made in the past, and they will not get out of the way during a succession process. They are basically self-absorbed, and although they may say a lot of nice things about their concern for the rest of the family and their concerns for their legacy and the like, they actually couldn't give a damn. These are very difficult, and these are the people who often blow families to pieces because the broken promises to their children often set up major conflict in the next generation down, which gets grandparents being barred from ever seeing their grandchildren, which is an awful thing to see and experience, but it's not uncommon. There's only one level above the severe narcissist, and that's the malignant narcissist. Now we're talking about Russian presidents. They seem to have had a few that could fall into that category. A couple of the conveners of World War II. These are the people who have zero concern about others, and it's all about their agenda, their plans, their domination of the situation. And these people can be a serious danger to world peace, let alone more local problems. I personally don't come across all that many of them in family business. Most of my clients top out at the severe narcissist level, but just to understand the complete spectrum, they are at the top end and they are way outside the bell curve of anything approaching normal. Now, one of the things about narcissists is they frequently struggle to establish intimacy, and that often comes with low emotional resilience as a consequence of an immature regulation system. The origins of narcissism in modern psychology date back to the 19th century, and a guy called Havelock Ellis, who diagnosed it first of all as a personality disorder, and then it was picked up by Freud in the last century, where he developed the theory of the ego, the id, and the super-id as three internal regulating systems based on what he regarded as man's core need for pleasure, satisfaction. And Freud believed that the ego is the regulator, the control mechanism that keeps the id and the superego under control. The id is the lizard brain that just seeks pleasure for the individual, couldn't give a damn about anything else. And the superego is the conscience that says, well, that's what I should be doing, but that's what I am doing, therefore I'm not doing the right thing at the moment. That makes life a bit complicated. I think it's easier to just consider we are all subject to forms of internal emotional regulation. And if we did not develop good systems of mature emotional regulation during the growing up years, if we had a difficult childhood, if we are genetically predisposed towards not proceeding beyond an immature worldview and immature social systems, then there's a good chance we're going to end up as narcissists. Because if during the early growing up years we were badly treated, or we perceived we were badly treated, if we were growing up in highly competitive environments where we didn't learn to collaborate, it was basically success at all costs, and you're the princeling or you are the princess, you're the most important thing on the earth, it's very difficult to learn the skills and the personal disciplines to not become narcissistic later in life. There are a few professions one could think about that seem to be particularly subject to this, but to avoid death threats I won't label them or list them. So the root cause of a lot of narcissism is not a deliberate choice by the narcissist, but it is rather the way they are genetically predisposed, plus the way they were conditioned as young children by their parents and by their environment, educational environment and ethnic environments, and were they literally groomed to become this type of person when they grew up. And there are some cultures that are much more likely to generate narcissistic personalities than others. That leads us then to thinking about how do you deal with a narcissistic personality to work things out. If we are able to understand that we are all narcissists to a degree, and somebody who has got extreme forms of narcissism is a person who is not in control of their own emotions and in all likelihood has been insecure and unhappy for their entire lives. It makes it very much easier to not see them as the enemy, but instead to see them as somebody who is deserving of a degree of sympathy because they are not in control of the way they think and act. They have never developed a mature system of emotional regulation, and they have probably been living in fear of being exposed as a fraud for a lot of their lives. They project aggression, domination, superiority, and it's all a protective screen to avoid anybody getting through to work out the fact that they are basically a quivering jelly deep inside. Now, if we react to people like that, saying this is a powerful person, so the only way they are going to pay any attention is if we overpower them, we will be doubling and trebling their defences because that's the last thing on earth they're prepared to accept. If, on the other hand, we're able to draw the curtain aside and recognise who and what they really are, and say, okay, you need some reassurance, you need to understand what the next step is, you need to have plenty of validation for who and what you are and what you have done. So we are able to say to you, you've done your job, you can now move on, and here is the good life you can have afterwards. If we can have that conversation, it's a big if, and if we can persuade them to move to a better rock because they no longer need to clutch the rock they've got, which is leadership of the business and leadership of the family, we're in with a chance of unblocking the succession process. So that's one of the main things that we will be suggesting as a strategic approach, and it's very difficult to do from within the family because the patterns of behaviours are so well set that anybody does a major change and it's viewed with suspicion and hard to do. Plus, narcissists tend to be very good manipulators and they know how to press people's buttons to put them off balance if they develop a strategy to try to move things into a place that they want but the narcissist doesn't know and won't acknowledge that they need. Finally, if you find yourself up against a narcissist who really does appear to be towards the far end of the scale, and it's virtually a personality disorder, a clinically definable personality disorder that you're actually dealing with, and it's almost impossible to have a rational conversation with that person because they feel threatened by almost any conversation that isn't just allowing them to take the lead, then you may need to bring in some heavy guns, and I think of those as the executive coaches who have psychological qualifications, and you never bring them in as a psych, never suggest mental disorders or mental illness or anything of that sort. Bring them in as a coach, and it can be a transition coach, but it sounds a bit like a menopause coach. It's a transition coach for a succession planning process. And their job is to understand what are the key levers and drivers of the individual and how do we help to get them comfortable with the idea of moving to that different space. They would normally be paired up with an expert facilitator or mediator who is then pulling all the other levers with the rest of the family, coaching them how to interact with this person to make a change without it being a destructive change in the behaviours. So it's a bit of a process. It can be done. It ain't easy. And I wish you good luck. If you do need help, get in touch, and we're more than happy to talk stuff through and perhaps render assistance. Also, if you know of anybody, because everybody knows somebody in a family business at the moment who is in a fraught succession process, if you know somebody you may get some benefit from having a listen to this video, please pass it on to them. And if you've had value yourself, please subscribe and come back for the next. We've got roughly another 47 of these coming, and we are going to try and deal with all 50 of the common causes of conflict in a family business. From me, Jon Kenfield, the Family Business Solutionist, thank you for watching.